The West had a way of chewing people up. It would find your weakness, sink its teeth in, and spit out the bones for the sun to bleach white. Most folks broke. They turned to dust and blew away on the wind. But some were different. Sometimes the ones who got broken the most came back stronger. Like iron pulled from the hottest fire, hammered and folded and quenched in pure suffering until it couldn't break again. It became something else entirely. Martha Sullivan was running. For 3 straight days she'd been running. Her lungs felt like they were tearing apart with every sharp breath she took. Thin branches like skeletal fingers whipped across her face, leaving angry red lines on her cheeks. She didn't slow down. She couldn't. Behind her, she could hear them, the crashing sound of horses and the shouting of men. They were tearing through the underbrush, and they were getting closer. Her legs were on fire. Every muscle was a scream of protest. But stopping wasn't an option. Not now. Not ever. The trees ahead suddenly thinned out, opening up to a sight that made her heart drop into her stomach. A cliff, a sheer, steep drop into a rocky ravine below. She skidded to a stop right at the edge, sending a cascade of loose rocks tumbling into the abyss. She spun around, her eyes darting across the tree line, her mind racing, calculating. There were no chances left. 2 men on horseback burst through the trees. They had rifles and they were raised. One wore a cheap bowler hat, tilted to the side. The other had a dirty bandana pulled up over his face. Then came 3 more. They spread out, forming a slow, deliberate semicircle. They were closing in like wolves cornering a deer. There was nowhere left to run. "Nowhere left to run, girl," the man in the bowler hat called out. His voice had a slimy southern drawl that made her skin crawl. "Jameson wants you back. Says you're too valuable to lose." Martha straightened up to her full height. She was nearly 6 feet tall, a giantess in this land of wiry men. Her wild red-gold hair framed a face set like stone, and her gray eyes were as cold and hard as steel. "I'm not property," she said. Her voice was low and steady, a dangerous rumble that defied the fear clawing at her insides. The man just laughed. It was a greasy, ugly sound. "Honey," he said, leaning forward in his saddle, "that's exactly what you are." He pointed a gloved finger at her. Asset S7. The name hit her like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. Her hand closed around a sharp-edged rock at her feet. In one smooth, impossibly fast motion, she spun and hurled it. The rock hit the lead rider square in the face with a sickening crunch. He tumbled backward off his horse, a mess of blood and surprise. Before the others could react, she charged. She ducked under the second man's rifle, grabbing his ankle and yanking him clean out of the saddle. She was almost on his horse, almost free, when something hard and heavy crashed against the back of her skull. The world tilted. The trees spun. The sky turned upside down. Then everything went black. The auction block in Redemption Springs wasn't made for people. It was made for cattle, for horses. You could see it in the rough-hewn timber, stained dark with decades of animal sweat and fear and blood. It was a place of endings, but today, under a sun that beat down without mercy, it held a different kind of merchandise. Wyatt Coleman stood at the back of the crowd, his hat pulled down low over his eyes. He wasn't here for this ugliness. He was in town for supplies, grain for his horses, ammunition for his rifle, maybe a new plow blade if Miller's General Store had one that wasn't rusted through. The auction was just background noise, the grim chatter of a town on the edge of nowhere. "Next up," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice cutting through the heat. "We got ourselves a woman. Good for housework, cooking, whatever you need." He gave a greasy wink, and a few of the men in the crowd chuckled. Wyatt shifted on his feet, a sour taste in his mouth. Selling people was supposed to be illegal, but out here, miles from any real law, they gave it fancy names. Labor contracting, domestic placement. Out here, the law was whatever the man with the most guns said it was. "Got this one from up north," the auctioneer continued, gesturing to his right. "Bit of a wild one if I'm being honest with you boys, but there's nothing a firm hand can't fix." 2 men dragged a woman onto the platform. Wyatt's breath caught in his throat. She was tall, taller than most men there, with a mane of red gold hair pulled back in a tight, messy braid. Her skin was darkened by the sun, and her forearms were corded with lean, powerful muscle. Heavy iron chains were shackled around her ankles, digging into her skin. But it was her eyes that held him frozen. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and fierce, and they weren't looking at the crowd. They were focused on some distant point on the horizon, as if she refused to even acknowledge the men who were staring at her like a piece of meat. She was there, but she wasn't. She had locked herself away somewhere deep inside. "Now I'll be straight with you," the auctioneer said, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. "She ain't exactly a gal made for polite company. Took down 2 marshals last week when they tried to feed her. Broke another man's arm with a broom handle." He rubbed his own jaw, where a faint purple bruise was already forming. "But she's strong as an ox," he added. "Damn good for farm work, if you think you can handle her." The crowd murmured. Men exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't some docile woman they could easily bend to their will. This was trouble. Nobody stepped forward. "Starting bid at $50, the auctioneer called out. Silence. The only sound was the wind kicking up dust in the square. $40 then. More silence. A few men snorted in derision. "Come on now, gentlemen, 30. She's worth more than that just for the work she can do." Wyatt didn't know why he did it. He didn't know what devil took hold of his hand and made him raise it. Maybe it was the way she stood there, chin held high, even in chains. Maybe it was the memory of another time, another place, when he'd been too slow, too late to stop something terrible from happening. Or maybe it was just that nobody, no matter who they were, deserved to be sold like an animal, especially not someone who so clearly refused to be broken. 30, he said. His voice was rough like gravel, from not being used much. A few men turned to look at him. Someone snickered and muttered, "Looks like old Coleman's finally looking for some company out at that godforsaken ranch of his." The auctioneer blinked, surprised. 30 from Wyatt Coleman, he announced, his eyes scanning the crowd hopefully. "Do I hear 35? Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. "She ain't exactly a gal made for company," the auctioneer hedged again, almost as if he was trying to warn Wyatt off a bad deal. "Might be more trouble than she's worth." 40 then, Wyatt said flatly. He just wanted it to be over. For the first time, the woman's eyes snapped to his. They were sharp, assessing. There was no gratitude in them, not a trace. But there was something else. Curiosity. Something twitched at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't a smile. Not even close. But it was something. "Sold!" the auctioneer grumbled, banging his gavel. "To Wyatt Coleman of Driftwood Ranch." The crowd started to break up, already losing interest, turning their attention to a pair of mules being led toward the block. Wyatt stepped forward, pulling a worn leather pouch from his pocket. He counted out the coins, the transaction completed with barely a word. The auctioneer handed him a folded piece of paper, a bill of sale, a document that supposedly gave him ownership of another human being. Wyatt stuffed it in his pocket without even looking at it. He walked up onto the platform. Up close, he could see the details he'd missed from a distance. A thin white scar ran along her jawline. Her forearms were a road map of smaller scars, crisscrossing each other like old forgotten battles. He knelt down. He wouldn't let anyone else touch her. He wouldn't treat her like cargo. He unlocked the chains himself. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice quiet. Her storm gray eyes met his. They were completely unflinching. "Mars," she said. The name was as strange and stark as she was. Like the god of war. Wyatt didn't reply. He just handed her the worn-out boots they'd taken from her. She pulled them on without a word of thanks, then stood there waiting. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't subservient. She was just present. Wyatt nodded toward the street where his wagon was tied. "I've got supplies to pick up," he said. "Then we ride." They left Redemption Springs just as the sun began to bleed across the horizon. The wagon was loaded with the supplies Wyatt had come for, plus a few things he hadn't planned on buying. A second blanket, a simple set of men's trousers and a shirt that he guessed might fit her tall frame. A small bag of dried apples that looked less shriveled than usual. Mars sat beside him on the wagon bench, as still as a statue. Her eyes were fixed on the west, watching the setting sun as if it held the answers to questions she hadn't dared to ask. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour before Wyatt finally spoke. "Ranch is about 20 miles out," he said, his eyes on the trail ahead. "It's nothing fancy. Been in my family for 2 generations." Mars gave a single, small nod, but didn't say anything. "You'll sleep in the bunkhouse, not the main house," he added, feeling a sudden need to draw a clear line in the sand. "Used to have hands to fill it. It's just me now." Another nod. Her expression didn't change. It was like talking to a rock. Wyatt glanced over at her, trying to read something, anything in her stoic profile. "You don't talk much." Her eyes flicked to his for just a second. "Neither do you." He let out a short, dry chuckle. "Fair point." He fell silent again, letting the steady clip-clop of the horses and the creak of the wagon wheels fill the vast, empty space between them. The sun sank lower, painting the harsh landscape in shades of copper and blood orange. The air began to cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. As the first stars began to appear, like tiny pinpricks of silver in the deep purple sky, Wyatt found himself stealing glances at the woman beside him, this complete stranger he'd just bought, like a sack of flour. What in the hell had he been thinking? It was as if she could read his mind. Mars turned her head slightly, her gaze catching his in the dimming light. "Why'd you do it?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but the question landed with the weight of a stone. Wyatt thought about lying. He thought about brushing it off, saying it was none of her business. But looking into those clear, searching eyes, he found himself telling the truth. "Don't rightly know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if he was a liar or just a fool. Then she turned her gaze back to the horizon. "Fair enough." Driftwood Ranch came into view as they crested a low, rolling hill. It wasn't much, just a modest spread carved out of an unforgiving land. There was a small main house with a porch that was starting to sag, a weathered barn that had seen better days, a set of corrals, and a small, separate bunkhouse off to the side. It wasn't pretty, but it was his. He'd built most of it back up with his own 2 hands after he'd returned from the war, when the only thing that made any sense was hard work and solitude. Mars took it all in silently as Wyatt pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the barn. He climbed down, his joints aching from the long ride. She followed, landing on the ground with a quiet grace, her hands loose at her sides, waiting for an order. Wyatt gestured with a sweep of his arm. "It's not much, but it's something. Barn there. Main house. Corrals need fixing. Chicken coop is around back." He pointed to the small building she'd been eyeing since they arrived. "That's the bunkhouse. It's yours." Mars looked at the bunkhouse, then back at Wyatt. There was a question in her eyes she didn't speak. He knew what it was. "It's not a cage," Wyatt said, understanding her suspicion. "The door doesn't lock from the outside." He paused, searching for the right words. They didn't come easy to him. "I don't own you," he said, the words feeling heavy and important. "That piece of paper says I do, but that paper isn't worth the ink it's printed with. You work for me. I feed you, give you a place to sleep. That's the deal. You want to leave, you just walk away. That's your choice." Something in her expression shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet. But the hard, protective shell around her seemed to crack, just a little. "Why would you say that?" she asked, her voice soft. "After paying good money." Wyatt shrugged, suddenly feeling awkward under her intense gaze. He turned and started unhitching the horses, needing something to do with his hands. "No man should own another," he said, his voice low. "The war taught me that much." He was aware of her eyes still on him, watching his every move. "There's a pump out back for washing up," he said over his shoulder. "I'll bring those clothes over once I get the horses settled." Mars gave a single nod and then, without another word, headed for the bunkhouse. Her stride was long and sure, like she belonged here, like she'd been walking this land for years instead of just minutes. Wyatt watched her go, a strange feeling twisting in his gut. For the first time since his brother Thomas had died, the ranch didn't feel so crushingly empty. And that scared him more than anything. The next morning, Wyatt woke at dawn, like he always did. But something was different. He pushed himself out of bed and looked out the window. And there she was, Mars, already outside, inspecting the corral fence with a critical eye. She'd washed up at the pump. Her wild hair, still damp at the ends, was tied back with a piece of twine. She'd changed into the clothes he'd left outside her door, a faded blue work shirt and tan trousers that, somehow, fit her tall frame perfectly. She looked up and saw him watching her. "Fence is rotting through on the south side," she said, her voice carrying easily across the yard. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "It won't hold anything stronger than a lazy mule." Wyatt was surprised. He hadn't expected her to start working without being told. He hadn't expected her to care. "Been meaning to fix that," he admitted, pulling on his boots. "I can do it," she said. "Saw a pile of lumber by the barn." It wasn't a question, it was a declaration. Wyatt just nodded. "Breakfast first. No point working on an empty stomach." Inside the small kitchen, Wyatt fried up salt pork and eggs. He sliced thick pieces of bread and poured 2 mugs of coffee so thick and black you could stand a spoon up in it. He watched her eat. She moved with a strange efficiency, as if she were used to having food taken away at any moment. She didn't savor it, didn't complain. She just ate, quickly. She took exactly half of everything he put on the table, and no more. "There's plenty," Wyatt said, pushing the cast iron pan toward her. "Take what you need." Her eyes flickered up to his. For a second, she looked uncertain. Then she carefully took one more slice of bread. "Thank you," she whispered. After breakfast, they fell into a rhythm. It was strange. It was like they'd been working together for years. Mars tackled the fence repair, moving with a quiet competence that impressed him. She knew her way around a hammer and saw. Wyatt tended to the horses and chickens, but he found his eyes drifting back to her again and again. By midday, she'd already replaced 3 rotting posts and had secured a long section of rails. At lunch, they sat on the porch steps, eating cold pork and bread. And Wyatt, a man who usually went weeks without speaking more than a handful of words, found himself talking. He told her about the ranch, about the spring that never ran dry, even in the worst droughts. He told her about the north pasture where the grass grew best, and about the temperamental wood stove in the kitchen that you had to sweet-talk to get it lit on a cold morning. Mars just listened. She'd ask a question now and then, practical questions, about water lines and predators and the quality of the soil. She never once asked about his past. She never asked why a man like him lived all alone out here. She never asked what had happened to the ranch hands who used to sleep in the bunkhouse she now called her own. It was a courtesy he returned. He never asked about the scars on her arms or who gave her the one on her jaw. And he never asked about the nightmares, the ones that had her pacing the floor of the bunkhouse in the dead of night. Her restless footsteps, a faint, ghostly sound he could hear through his own open window. The days started to bleed into one another. They settled into a routine, a quiet rhythm of hard work and shared silent meals. Mars was more than just a good worker. She was invaluable. She was stronger than she looked, surprisingly capable with tools, and completely unafraid of the wild stallion Wyatt had been trying to gentle for months. The horse was a magnificent black beast, but full of fire and fear. It wouldn't let anyone near it. Wyatt was about to give up, sell it for whatever he could get, but the horse seemed to tolerate Mars. It would let her stand by the corral fence, just watching it with those storm-gray eyes of hers. One evening, Wyatt found her there. She was leaning on the top rail of the fence as the stallion paced back and forth, tossing its black mane, its eyes wide and white. "He won't let anyone touch him," Wyatt said, coming to stand beside her. The setting sun cast their long shadows across the dusty yard. "Tried everything. Might have to sell him." Mars shook her head, her gaze never leaving the horse. "He's not mean," she said softly. "He's afraid." "Out here, that's the same thing," Wyatt replied. "An afraid horse is a dangerous horse." "Only if you try to break them," she said. She kept her eyes on the stallion, which had stopped its nervous pacing to watch them. "Breaking things isn't the only way to make them useful," she added. Wyatt looked at her profile in the golden light. He had the strange feeling she wasn't just talking about the horse anymore. "What's the alternative?" he asked. "Respect." She finally turned to look at him, and in that moment, something passed between them. It wasn't a word. It was a feeling, an understanding, or maybe just the beginning of one. "Show him you're not a threat," she said. "Let him come to you." Wyatt nodded slowly. might take a long time. Some things do. As if on cue, the stallion took a cautious step toward the fence. Its nostrils flared, taking in their scent. Mars didn't move a muscle. The horse stretched its neck out, its ears flicking forward, then back, deciding. Don't move, she murmured to Wyatt. Let him choose. The stallion let out a soft snort, its hot breath visible in the cooling air. It extended its muzzle, farther, farther, until it was just barely touching Mars's outstretched, open hand. For a long, breathless moment, they stayed like that, a woman and a wild beast, locked in a silent negotiation of trust. Then the stallion pressed its nose firmly into her palm and let out a long, soft sigh. Wyatt watched, completely mesmerized, as Mars began to stroke the animal's face. Her movements were slow, gentle, and deliberate, the stallion's eyes half closed in what looked like pure contentment. How did you learn to do that? Wyatt asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mars didn't take her eyes off the horse. When people treat you like an animal for long enough, she said, her voice flat and empty, you learn to understand them. The screaming woke him from a dead sleep. It was a raw, terrified sound that ripped through the silence of the night. Wyatt was out of bed and grabbing his rifle before he was even fully awake. His heart hammered against his ribs. The screams were coming from the bunkhouse. He ran barefoot across the cold, dusty yard, his mind racing. Intruders? A snake? A wildcat? He burst through the door and found Mars alone. She was thrashing in her narrow cot, tangled in her single blanket, fighting enemies that weren't there. No! She cried out, her arms flailing. Not the device! Please, not again! Wyatt froze in the doorway. He set his rifle down and approached her cautiously. This was a private hell, and he felt like a trespasser. Mars, he called out gently. Mars, wake up. You're dreaming. She didn't hear him. She was lost somewhere else, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't imagine. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, and her face was twisted in a mask of pure terror he'd never seen on her awake. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. Mars! It happened so fast he didn't even see it coming. Her eyes flew open, but they were unseeing, wild. In a single fluid motion, her hands shot up and clamped around his throat. Her grip was like iron. Wyatt choked, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. He couldn't breathe. His hands came up instinctively, trying to break her hold, but her strength was unbelievable. Then in an instant, recognition flooded her eyes. She let go as if his skin had burned her. She scrambled backward, away from him, until her back hit the rough wooden wall of the bunkhouse. The terror on her face was replaced by a look of pure horror. I'm sorry, she gasped, her voice shaking. I thought... Wyatt rubbed his throat, taking in deep, ragged breaths. It's all right, he managed to say. My fault. I shouldn't have touched you. She drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, trying to make herself smaller. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he could see the scars on her arms more clearly than ever before. They weren't random. They were patterns. Strange, symmetrical patterns. Almost like someone had tried to wire something directly into her skin. Who did that to you? He asked quietly, nodding toward her arms. Mars looked down as if surprised to see them. She quickly pulled her sleeves down, covering the marks. People who think they can own other people, she answered. Her voice was hollow, dead. She looked up at him, her eyes dark with a terrible certainty. And they'll be coming back for me. Wyatt sat on the edge of her cot, giving her space but not wanting to leave her alone with the shadows that haunted her. You want to tell me about it? She was silent for so long, he thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her eyes were fixed on some point just beyond the bunkhouse walls. They call themselves Phoenix, she said, her voice a near whisper. They don't just buy and sell people. They make them, remake them. Her hand unconsciously traced one of the hidden scars through the fabric of her sleeve. They wanted soldiers. Soldiers who wouldn't question orders, who wouldn't feel fear or pain or mercy. A cold dread trickled down Wyatt's spine. And they did that, to you, Mars nodded slowly. I was one of their subjects. Subject S7. The name came out like poison on her tongue. But I wasn't what they wanted. I was too wild. They said I couldn't be properly conditioned. So they sold you. They expected me to kill whoever bought me. Her eyes finally met his, and there was a strange look in them, something like wonder. That was the test, to see if the conditioning still worked, even when they weren't controlling the device. Device? Wyatt asked, leaning forward slightly. What device? A visible shudder ran through her entire body. A helmet, she whispered. It, it changes you. It makes you someone else. Something else. When they put it on you, you're still in there, somewhere deep down, but you can't stop yourself. You just have to watch while your body does these terrible things. Wyatt struggled to process what she was saying. It sounded like something out of a crazy dime novel, but the scars on her arms were real. The terror in her eyes was real. You're safe here, he said finally, the words feeling thin and useless. He knew it was probably a lie. Mars gave him a sad, broken little smile. No one's safe from them. Not really. She straightened up, pulling the mask of stoicism back over her face. You should go back to sleep. I'm fine now. Wyatt hesitated. He didn't want to leave, but he knew she needed the space. He stood up and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. Mars. She looked up. Thank you, he said, for telling me. She gave him a single solemn nod. Wyatt stepped out into the cool night air, but the chill he felt had nothing to do with the temperature. His mind was churning with what she'd told him, a helmet that could control people, a secret group called Phoenix. And they were coming back for her. He looked up at the vast star-filled sky, and for the first time in a long time, Wyatt Coleman felt truly afraid. 3 weeks passed. An uneasy peace settled over Driftwood Ranch. The fence was repaired, stronger than it had ever been. The small garden was weeded and expanded. The chicken coop was reinforced against coyotes and foxes. Life fell into a pattern. Mars continued to work with the stallion. She spent hours with him every day. Sometimes she would just stand in the corral, talking to him in a low, soothing voice that Wyatt could never quite make out. By the end of the 3rd week, she was grooming him, brushing his sleek black coat while he stood perfectly calm, nuzzling her shoulder. She had named him Shadow. Wyatt found himself watching her more and more. The way she moved with such quiet confidence. The way she always seemed to know what needed to be done without him ever having to ask. The way a rare, small smile would sometimes touch her lips when she thought he wasn't looking. They fell into a comfortable routine. They worked side by side during the day. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch steps, not talking, just watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains. Wyatt would whittle a piece of scrap wood, and Mars would mend clothes or repair a piece of leather tack. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was peaceful. It was the silence of two lonely people who understood that some wounds were too deep for words. One evening, as the sky was exploding in a spectacular display of orange and purple, Mars spoke without being prompted. What happened to your brother? Wyatt's whittling knife stilled in his hand. He'd never told her about Thomas. He'd never told anyone in years. What makes you think I had a brother? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. There's a grave, she said simply, on the North Ridge, a small wooden cross. It says, Thomas Coleman, same last name as you. He was too young to be your father. Wyatt set his knife and the piece of wood down on the porch step beside him. He stared out at the darkening land, the memory as fresh as if it were yesterday. He fell, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. From the South Ridge, chasing a steer that broke loose. We just had a heavy rain. The ground gave way. The words were mechanical. He'd rehearsed them 100 times. Mars was silent for a long moment. Then she said softly, You blame yourself. It wasn't a question. Wyatt let out a long, slow breath. I was supposed to be with him. I stayed behind to fix a broken fence. The bitter irony of it wasn't lost on him. Another broken fence. Another failure to protect what was his. The wind rustled through the dry grass, the sound like a long, sad sigh. I don't think that's how blame works, Mars said, her voice quiet but firm. Sometimes the land just takes who it wants. Wyatt didn't answer. He just looked at her. Really looked at her. She was watching the last sliver of sun disappear, her jaw set, her arms resting on her knees like a soldier on watch. And in that moment, he realized she knew more about blame and loss than he could ever imagine. "Thank you," he said finally, "for saying that." She just nodded. They returned to their comfortable silence as the first stars pricked the deep velvet of the night sky. But their peace was about to be shattered. The man came at high noon. The sun was a white-hot coin in the sky, and there were no shadows to hide in. Wyatt saw the dust first, a rising plume on the eastern trail. He was on the roof of the shed, nailing down a loose shingle. He climbed down immediately, his hand instinctively going to the pistol holstered at his hip. "Mars!" he called out, his voice sharp. She appeared in the doorway of the barn, a curry comb in her hand. She saw the look on his face, followed his gaze to the dust cloud, and her entire body went still. Without a word, she moved to stand slightly behind him on the porch. To a stranger, it might have looked submissive, but Wyatt knew what she was doing. She was giving herself a clear line of sight and room to move if things went bad. The vehicle that rolled up to the ranch wasn't a dusty wagon. It was a buggy, a black buggy, polished to a high shine, pulled by two sleek bay horses that were far too fine for this part of the country. The man who stepped down was just as out of place. He was tall and slender, dressed in an immaculate gray suit, complete with a silk vest and clean white gloves. Despite the blistering heat, a gold watch chain glinted on his chest. "Mr. Coleman, I presume," he called out. His accent was refined, educated. "Not from around here." Wyatt didn't move from his spot on the porch. "That's right. And you're a long way from home, mister." The man smiled. It was a perfect, predatory smile, full of white teeth. "Harrison Wells at your service," he said, removing his pristine hat in a gesture of politeness that felt completely fake. "I believe," he said, his eyes flicking past Wyatt to the woman standing behind him, "you have something of mine." Wyatt felt Mars tense up. It was a barely perceptible movement, but he felt it. "Don't know what you're talking about," Wyatt said, his voice flat and even. Wells's smile didn't waver. "Oh, I think you do. My property. Subject S7, I believe she was designated." "Her name is Mars," Wyatt said, his voice turning to cold iron. "And she's not property." "I beg to differ." Wells reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded document. "I have the papers, properly signed, notarized. She was sold to me by the Phoenix Corporation in a private transaction. The man who auctioned her in that pathetic little town had no legal right to do so. She was already mine." Wyatt didn't even glance at the paper. "She's not yours." "She was sold to me," Wells repeated, the smile still plastered on his face, but his eyes were growing as cold as a winter river. "The paperwork is legally binding." Wyatt took a small step forward. "Then you've got a problem." The smile finally vanished from Harrison Wells' face. "No, Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You have a problem." He carefully placed his hat back on his head. "I'll be back," he promised, "and I'll bring men who are very, very good at fixing problems." He turned and climbed back into his buggy without another word. As the polished vehicle pulled away, kicking up a cloud of dust, Wyatt turned to Mars. Her face was a blank mask, but her eyes were locked on the retreating buggy with a fiery intensity. "Who is he?" Wyatt asked. "One of Phoenix's best buyers," she said, her voice tight. "They don't just make weapons. They sell them, to the highest bidder." She finally looked at him, and the fear she'd been hiding was now plain to see. "I told you they'd come." Wyatt nodded, his jaw clenched. He looked back at the trail of dust, now just a faint smudge on the horizon. "How long do we have?" "A day, maybe two. He'll bring men, a lot of them." Wyatt looked around at his small, vulnerable ranch, at the sagging porch and the weathered barn. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was theirs. "Then we'd better get ready." They worked through the night. The moon was a cold, silver sliver in the sky, watching them. Mars moved with a chilling efficiency, like a soldier preparing a battlefield. She seemed to know exactly what to do. She positioned lanterns in strange places around the corral, creating false targets for anyone approaching in the dark. She oiled the hinges on the barn's back gate until it swung open without a sound. She led the horses, including her beloved Shadow, out to the far pasture, where they'd be safe from any crossfire. Wyatt, meanwhile, went into the main house. He pried up a loose floorboard in his bedroom, revealing a dark, hidden space beneath. From it, he pulled out a long, heavy wooden chest. Inside were the ghosts of his past: two old pistols, a sawed-off shotgun, and boxes of ammunition. At the very bottom of the chest was a small, oilskin pouch. He picked it up, his face grim. He stared at it for a long, silent moment, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. Then he tucked it securely into his belt. Mars never asked what was in it. Later, as the first hints of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, they stood together by the water trough, checking their preparations one last time. The air was still and heavy with anticipation. Mars looked at him, her face pale in the pre-dawn light. "I won't let them take me back there," she said. It wasn't a plea, it was a vow. Wyatt didn't make any false promises. He didn't say they couldn't take her. He just said, "They'll have to go through me first." Her eyes searched his face, looking for something he couldn't name. He didn't know if she found it, but she gave a single sharp nod. She accepted his word. "Get some rest," he told her. "I'll take the first watch." She hesitated. Then she did something that surprised him. She reached out and her fingers briefly, lightly touched his arm. It was the first time she had ever initiated any kind of physical contact. "Wake me in 4 hours," she said. "You need rest too." She turned and walked toward the bunkhouse. Wyatt watched her go, a strange knot tightening in his chest. He thought about the bizarre twist of fate that had brought this incredible broken woman to his doorstep. And he was struck by the even stranger feeling that he would burn the whole world down to keep her safe, to keep her free. The day rose heavy and slow. The air was thick and still, trapping the heat of the approaching summer. Every gust of wind sounded like the thunder of hoofbeats. Every crow that cawed from a distant treetop felt like a warning. Wyatt stood by the barn, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Mars was inside the corral with Shadow. The stallion was pacing nervously, picking up on the tension that hung over the ranch like a shroud. She spoke to him in that low, quiet voice of hers, one hand resting on his powerful neck, steadying them both. They came just before noon. Wyatt checked his pocket watch. 11:53. They came from the east, just as he knew they would. 6 riders, fanning out in a practiced military-style formation. Behind them were 2 heavy wagons, and sitting on the bench of the lead wagon, dressed in his immaculate black coat, was Harrison Wells. The riders spread out, encircling the ranch yard. Their hands hovered casually near their weapons. Wells dismounted without any ceremony, taking a moment to brush imaginary dust from his sleeves, as if he could maintain his air of refined civilization out here in the dirt and the grit. "I gave you a chance, Mr. Coleman," Wells called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "More time than you deserved." Mars stepped out of the corral, closing the gate carefully behind her. She walked to stand beside Wyatt. "You're not taking me," she said, her voice clear and strong. Wells let out a short, condescending laugh. "My dear girl, you have no say in the matter. You belong to me, bought and paid for." He gestured dismissively toward Wyatt. "And your new friend here is guilty of harboring stolen property. That is a serious crime in this territory." "Then you'll need a badge," Wyatt said, his rifle still held loosely, but ready. Wells smiled that cold, dead smile again. "As a matter of fact, I brought one." One of the riders, an older, grizzled man with a mean-looking face, urged his horse forward. Pinned to his dusty vest was a tarnished silver star. Wyatt vaguely recognized him, a crooked deputy from a town 2 days' ride east, a man known for being in whatever pocket was paying the most. "I don't recognize your authority out here," Wyatt said plainly. "Then maybe you'll recognize this," the deputy snarled, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. But the first shot didn't come from the deputy. It didn't come from Wyatt. It came from the roof of the bunkhouse. A puff of white smoke bloomed against the blue sky. The crack of a rifle echoed across the yard. One of the riders screamed and fell backward out of his saddle, his shoulder a mess of blood. Mars had hidden a second rifle up there the night before. All hell broke loose. The yard erupted in gunfire and chaos. Wyatt fired deliberately, his shots precise. He wasn't aiming to kill. Not yet. He was aiming to disarm. A rifle flew from one man's hands. A pistol spun out of another's. Mars moved through the chaos like a ghost. A deadly, graceful ghost. She used the confusion to dart from the cover of the porch, scoop up one of the fallen weapons, and slide it across the dirt to Wyatt without breaking stride. Through it all, Harrison Wells just stood there, by his wagon. He watched the fight with a look of cold, clinical detachment, like a scientist observing an experiment. When another one of his men went down, clutching a bloody leg, Wells frowned slightly as if annoyed by the mess. He raised a single gloved hand. "Enough!" he called out. To Wyatt's surprise, his men obeyed instantly. They fell back, taking up defensive positions behind the wagons. The sudden silence was deafening. "This is becoming unnecessarily messy," Wells said with a sigh. "Leave," Wyatt said, his rifle still raised and aimed at Wells's chest. "And don't come back." Wells actually chuckled. "Mr. Coleman, surely you're a businessman at heart. Everything has a price. Name yours for the girl. Whatever you paid for her at that pathetic auction, I'll triple it." "She's not for sale." Wells's eyes narrowed. "And if money won't persuade you, perhaps other means will." He gave a short, sharp nod to one of his men. The man struck a match and casually tossed it into a large bale of hay sitting next to the barn. The dry straw went up in an instant, a whoosh of heat and bright orange flame. Another man lit a torch from the blaze and started walking toward the bunkhouse. Wyatt fired. The bullet kicked up dirt right at the man's feet. "Next one goes through your knee," he said, his voice dangerously calm. The man froze, looking back at Wells for instructions. But Mars didn't wait. She launched herself off the porch, running barefoot across the sharp gravel of the yard. She ran straight for the burning hay bale. With a strength that seemed impossible for her frame, she grabbed the blazing bale and dragged it away from the barn wall. She heaved it, trailing sparks and smoke, into the horse trough. It hit the water with a loud hiss, sending up a plume of steam. Wells watched her, his eyes wide with a look of undisguised fascination. "Remarkable," he murmured to himself. The physical enhancements were certainly a success. Then he raised his voice, and it took on a strange, commanding tone, a tone that wasn't human. "S7. Report." Mars froze. Her back went rigid. Her hands, blackened with soot, clenched into tight fists at her sides. For one terrible, heart-stopping moment, Wyatt thought she was going to obey. He thought some deeply buried conditioning had taken hold. Then she slowly turned around. Her eyes were blazing with a fire brighter than the smoldering hay. "My name," she said, her voice low and shaking with rage, each word a deliberate, carefully aimed blow, "is Mars." For the first time, Wells's perfect composure cracked. His face twisted into a mask of pure fury. "You are Phoenix property, Subject S7. You were born in a Phoenix lab. You are nothing but a project." "I was born free," Mars shot back, her voice ringing with defiance. "And I'll die that way." That was it. Wells lost control. He drew a small, elegant-looking pistol from inside his coat. "If I can't have my property back," he shrieked, his voice high and shrill, "then no one will." He aimed the pistol straight at her heart. Wyatt fired first. His bullet struck Wells's arm. The small pistol went flying through the air. Wells howled in pain and rage, clutching his bleeding limb. "Get off my land," Wyatt said, his voice as deadly and calm as a coiled snake. He levered another round into the chamber of his rifle, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. "All of you, now!" The hired guns and the crooked deputy didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled to gather their wounded, abandoning one of their wagons in their haste. They half-dragged, half-carried the shrieking Harrison Wells back to his buggy. "This isn't over, Coleman!" Wells screamed as they pulled away, his face a contorted mask of hatred. "Phoenix doesn't lose what belongs to it. We will be back. We will burn this place to the ground." Wyatt kept his rifle trained on them until they were nothing but a cloud of dust on the horizon. Only then did he lower the weapon. He turned to Mars. She was still standing by the water trough, her hands black, her shirt scorched. She was trembling, not from fear, but from adrenaline and rage. Without a word, Wyatt crossed the yard to her. He gently took her wrists and turned her hands over, checking her palms for burns. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough and tight with an emotion he couldn't bring himself to name. Mars looked down at her soot-covered hands held in his. Then she looked up, into his eyes. "I didn't want to lose my home," she said softly. "Not again." Home. The word hung in the air between them. Simple, powerful, true. Wyatt suddenly realized he was still holding her hands. He let go quickly and stepped back, feeling awkward. "Let's get those hands cleaned up," he said gruffly, turning toward the house to hide the expression on his face. Mars followed him, her bare feet leaving wet, sooty footprints in the dust. That night the ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, a heavy, waiting kind of quiet. Mars sat at the small kitchen table, her hands cleaned and bandaged. Her eyes were red and raw from the smoke. Wyatt moved around the kitchen, making a pot of coffee that neither of them really wanted. It just gave him something to do with his hands, something to keep him from just staring at her. "You're not what I expected," he said finally, placing a steaming mug on the table in front of her. A tiny, fleeting smile touched her lips. "Neither are you." Wyatt sat down across from her. He studied her face in the warm, flickering lamplight. The proud, defiant woman from the auction block was still there, but now he could see the other layers too. The intelligence, the courage, and the deep, painful vulnerability she kept so carefully guarded. "What Wells said," he began, his voice hesitant, "about you being born for Project Phoenix. What did he mean by that?" Mars wrapped her bandaged hands around the warm mug, as if absorbing its strength. She stared down into the black liquid, silent for so long that Wyatt thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "He meant exactly what he said," she began, her gaze still fixed on the mug. "I wasn't born, not in the usual way. My mother was a subject. My father was one of the scientists. They didn't see me as a child. They saw me as the next phase of the project, a new model." She took a shaky breath. "They raised me in a lab. No name, just a number. S7. They trained me, tested me, pushed me. From the moment I could walk, they taught me how to fight, how to endure pain, how to shut off my emotions. They enhanced me, made me stronger, faster than a normal person." "The device," Wyatt said softly. "The helmet." She nodded. "That was the final step, the control mechanism. It bypasses your will, your conscience. It turns you into a perfect, obedient weapon. I fought it. I resisted more than the others. That's why they called me a failure. That's why they sold me off as damaged goods." Wyatt felt a cold fury building inside him, a rage colder and harder than anything he'd ever felt before. He reached across the table and his hand covered hers. He didn't say anything. He just held on, a silent promise. She looked up, and for the first time he saw tears welling in her storm-gray eyes. "They're not going to stop, Wyatt," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Wells was right. They'll come back. They'll burn this place down. They'll kill you to get to me." "Let them come," Wyatt said, his voice a low growl. He squeezed her hand gently. "We'll be ready for them." But even as he said the words, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. This wasn't just about a few hired guns anymore. This was about something much bigger and much more dangerous. And they were standing right in its path. The next attack came sooner than they expected. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was something more insidious, more cruel. It happened 2 days later. Wyatt was out checking the northern fence line when he saw the smoke. A thick, black pillar rising from the direction of the ranch house. His blood ran cold. He spurred his horse into a frantic gallop, his heart pounding in his chest. He prayed he wasn't too late. He prayed she was okay. As he got closer, the scene of devastation came into view. The main house was engulfed in flames. The barn was already a collapsed, smoldering ruin. The chicken coop was gone. They hadn't just attacked the ranch, they had erased it. He leaped from his horse before it had even come to a full stop, his rifle in his hand. "Mar!" he screamed, his voice raw with panic. "Mars!" There was no answer, just the roar and crackle of the fire. He ran toward the inferno, the heat so intense it seared his skin. He searched frantically, his eyes scanning the yard for any sign of her. Then he saw it. Near the burning remnants of the bunkhouse lying in the dust was a single scorched leather glove, one of the white gloves Harrison Wells had been wearing, and next to it, scrawled in the dirt, was a single chilling message. Phoenix always collects. They had her. They had taken her. A wave of pure black rage washed over Wyatt. It was a rage so powerful it blotted out everything else. The grief, the fear, the despair. He looked at the ruins of his home, the legacy his father and grandfather had built, now just ashes and smoke. It was all gone. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous man in the territory. He stood there for a long moment, the smoke and ashes swirling around him. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. He checked his rifle. He checked his pistol. He reached into his belt and pulled out the small oilskin pouch he had taken from the hidden chest. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a U.S. Marshal's badge, tarnished and old but real. It had been his father's. He pinned it to his shirt. He was no longer just a rancher. He was the law, and he was going to bring the wrath of God down on Phoenix. He didn't know where they had taken her. He didn't know how many men they had. He didn't know if she was even still alive. But it didn't matter. He mounted his horse. He had one direction to go. East. Back toward so-called civilization. Back toward the town with the crooked deputy. He would start there. He would find their trail, and he would follow it to the gates of hell if he had to. He would burn Phoenix to the ground, and he would get Mars back. Or he would die trying. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of survival and justice from the wild, untamed West.